old Garrison site. And it's significant for many, many reasons, which you'll learn about tonight. But I want to commend the Historical Commission, of which Judy Lund is the chair, for all the work they've done over many years. I've been a member of that commission for many years, but the work commenced on getting national recognition for the site, the Garrison site, before I was a member of the commission. And I commend Judy and the committee for carrying this through with the help of Holly, who is going to be talking about it. And I think it's a real significant thing for our town. Not very many towns have very many historic sites on the National Register. We have more than one. And I think it's important to recognize it and learn a little bit more about it, because it's exciting history to learn about what happened right here in town in a place owned by a man named Russell, and we'll learn about it in Russell's Mills, which was named for some of his descendants. And so, without more ado, I'm going to ask Judy to introduce Holly, who is our guest speaker, because Judy deserves a lot of credit, and I hope you'll give her the credit for helping make this happen. Okay,
Judy didn't do anything.
Well, very modest.
Bob could have done this as well as I could do it, for sure. I'm here to introduce to you someone I've known for rather a long while, because she's done other work in Dartmouth. She's been at Public Archaeology Lab for a very long time, I was surprised to read.
Yes.
When did Public Archaeology Lab begin?
We started in 1987 out of Brown University. The company kind of was an offshoot of the graduate department in archaeology.
Oh, great. Well, I figured that looking at the dates, it was probably, you were there on the ground floor.
Yep.
And Holly has degrees from Kenyon College and from UMass Boston, and she's certainly a professional in this field. She did the archaeological survey at the town of Dartmouth rather a long time ago now.
I think it was 2002 that survey was finished.
But we're very pleased this has finally come to pass. It's been a long process. As Bob says, it started before he was on the commission. Getting things through the state takes a while, but they've finally done it, and soon we'll put some sort of sign on it to commemorate it. But let's let Holly tell the story. You don't need to listen to me.
Can everybody see, by the way? Should I back up a little bit here so you can see the screen better? How's that? Okay. Thank you, Bob and Judy, and thanks everybody for coming out today, this afternoon. It is really my great privilege to be able to talk to you about the Russell Garrison. I have, as Judy mentioned, a long sort of professional relationship with the town of Dartmouth that started back in the early 2000s when Pal worked on the townwide archaeological reconnaissance survey. With the support of the Dartmouth Historical Commission. Those of you who are Dartmouth residents have an extremely robust and very active historical commission, so I commend you for that. There are a lot of towns in Massachusetts that don't put the level of effort and money, because it's not for free, into historic preservation, so it's been a real joy to work with the town on this project and the others. I am an archaeologist by training, but my research interests really are in early colonial and Native American history in New England, and I've done a lot of primary research both with records and also working with modern day Wampanoag community members on sort of reconstructing historical events from past days in Massachusetts. So this project at the Russell Garrison was really a great melding of the things that I'm really interested in doing, and also my interest in working with the community members in Dartmouth. Okay, let's go to our first slide. Thank you. So both Judy and Bob mentioned this, but the Russell Garrison is important for a number of reasons. It's really significant and a unique example in New England of, first of all, a site that has been preserved for over 300 years. I mean, Massachusetts, as you know, has a very deep, long history. We'll talk a little bit about the ancient history in a few minutes, but the colonial history in Massachusetts is really well documented. And there are a lot of well-documented historical events that date back to the 1600s, but there are very few places that have been preserved and can be noted with an X marks the spot on the landscape, and the Russell Garrison is one of those places. We know the exact location of the house that was built in the 1640s, and you can see the outline on the screen here of the foundation, which was reconstructed in its original location. How many of you have been out to the site of the Russell Garrison? Awesome. Okay, so the vast majority of you know about it. Okay. So again, knowing the exact location where this house stood, it's not somewhere in this 500 acres, it's not over there by the river. This is the spot where this house was built. It's also significant because there are some well-documented events that occurred during King Philip's War in the 1670s where eyewitnesses, people who were there on the day that these events happened, recorded their impressions of things that happened at this spot at the Russell Garrison. And I'm going to talk about those in a few minutes. Another reason that this site is significant is because the reconstruction of the site, which happened in the 1950s, was actually one of the earliest historical archaeological projects that happened in New England. So Oliver Garrison Ricketson, who was a professional academic archaeologist who did the work, and again, I'm going to talk about him in a few minutes. This is just a precursor to what we're going to be talking about. His work in the 1950s preceded by several years the work of prominent New England archaeologists like Jim Dietz, who did most of the excavations and reconstructions at Plymouth, and other early New England historical archaeologists. So at the time that that work was being done, this was one of the first reconstructions of a colonial era site that had been undertaken in New England. So all of these things make the National Register significance of the site even more so. Another really important fact is that we have ample evidence, you're going to see a lot of examples of it, of how this site was remembered by the residents of Dartmouth continuously from the time it was occupied by the Russell family up to the present day. There was no time during the town's history when there weren't reminiscences about this site, when there weren't newspaper articles written about it. So over time, a lot of early historical sites in New England, we might have a little bit of information from a certain period, and then hundreds of years go by, and then people are interested again, and we go back and try and put the story together. Here at the Russell Garrison, that didn't happen. We have this continuous record of documentation, of people talking about the condition of the site, of people knowing that the site was still there. And probably that's a really big reason why this site didn't get developed. And lastly, it's significant as a commemorative site. So the reconstruction of the foundations, the fact that the town of Dartmouth, first the Old Dartmouth Historical Society, later the Dartmouth Historical Commission, have recognized this as a commemorative site and identified it as important in the town's history. That's also something that contributes to its significance. So all of those things I'm going to give you a little bit more background on today, and as we kind of go through time to talk about the history of the site. I will make sure to give time at the end for questions or anyone who might have comments. So there will be plenty of time for that afterwards. Okay? Next slide, please. So I want to start in the pre-John Russell days and talk a little bit about the Native American history in Dartmouth. I'm sure most of you here know that your community has a very long history of documented Native American habitation and land use that stretches back as much as 10,000 years. So from the earliest days after the glaciers receded from New England, there were Native people, the ancestors of the present-day Wampanoag people who still live in this community, and perhaps some members of the Native community are here in the audience today. So there were people on the landscape here, living here as their homelands, going back 10,000 years or more. The photo over on the right is just to give you an example. When we did the townwide archaeological survey in 2002, those were the locations of known archaeological sites before we even started the survey. So those are places that were known either from people collecting arrowheads or artifacts, from documentary records, from people finding shell pits in their yards and their farm fields. So there's really a long history of documentation and land use, especially closer to the coast and along the major rivers. And these are just some materials that actually are from Dartmouth. The slide at the top is a little pot and some very early projectile points. We know that from the style of them, that those points date to about 9,000 or 10,000 years ago. Those were in the collection of a prominent Dartmouth avocational archaeologist. Sites like the one in the top left, that sort of black band that you kind of see in this image right here, that is a lens of shell mixed with dark soil that is indicative of a Native American shell trash pit. And I put that picture in there because later on when I talk about the excavations at the site in the 1950s, there's a description that pretty much matches that. That probably was a native shell midden on the site. And then at the bottom here, that's a piece of pottery, decorated pottery kind of in the center there, clay pottery that was made probably somewhere between 1,000 and 500 years ago. And when you look at the landscape of Aponagansett Bay, it would have been, at the time that Native people were living here, just rich with marine resources, all kinds of shellfish, freshwater streams running in and out of it. This would have been a major transportation corridor for Native people going from the coast into the interior, for trading, for resource collection. So really anywhere along the shores of Aponagansett Bay and the river, you're likely to find archaeological resources. And I'm talking about all this because the site that John Russell selected for his homestead was almost certainly an ancient Native American habitation site before John Russell arrived there. And there are actually comments throughout the centuries, people writing reports about visiting the site and talking about stone objects being found, remnants of the Indians and whatnot. So while we don't have good documentation at the Russell Garrison site for how Native people used it, we know that Native people were there before John Russell arrived and made it his homestead. Next, please. So the earliest history of Dartmouth is that we know that sometime around 1602, Bartholomew Gosnold, who was one of the early English explorers of the southwestern coast, recorded landing at what is today present-day Round Hill. So we know there was early interaction with Europeans and Native Americans in this part of Dartmouth. The original boundary of Old Dartmouth included about 75,000 acres. And you can see this is kind of a reconstruction of what was originally Dartmouth. So it included parts of, other communities today. So we had Westport, we had present-day New Bedford, Acushnet, even parts of what's today Rhode Island were considered part of Old Dartmouth. And the lands of Old Dartmouth were purchased by a series of proprietors. There were 36 of them from Plymouth Colony. Many of them were original founders of Plymouth. And they were purchased from the sachem Massasoit and his son Wamsutta. And we use the term purchase, as most of you are probably aware, kind of loosely. There were different conceptions between Native people and Europeans about what land ownership meant and what that entailed. And as events unfolded later on in the 17th century, this became very apparent. But initially, what was considered to be Old Dartmouth was land that had been legally, in the eyes of the colonists, purchased from the chief sachem Massasoit. So 1664 is when Dartmouth is established officially. Prior to the 1670s, there's very little indication that there were a lot of people living in Old Dartmouth. So lands were acquired. Some of them were given to people like Miles Standish, for example, who lived elsewhere but was given this land sort of as an investment to do with what he wanted to. One of the biggest problems with reconstructing this early 17th century history of Dartmouth is that in 1725, all of the town records that dated from the earliest period were lost in a fire. At that time, the clerk of the colony was a person who just kept the records in his home. His home burned down. And so the very earliest records that we have of the town itself were lost. So there are some gaps there. There are records in the Plymouth Colony Court that kind of document official things that happened in Dartmouth, but we do have a little bit of a black hole where that goes. Next slide, please. So John Russell, based on what I've read from a number of local scholars, there's a lot of debate about who was the first Russell and where did the first Russell arrive. So I can't tell you for sure that John Russell was the first of his surname to arrive in Dartmouth, but Historian William Wing, who did most of the research that we have about John Russell and was in fact a fifth-generation descendant of John Russell, compiled a lot of information, and he suggests that in fact John was the first of his name to come to Dartmouth. John Russell was first noted in the colonies in Marshfield, Massachusetts, where he had established a homestead. Marshfield at the time was also part of Plymouth Colony. And from the records, we know that he was a pretty well-established, prominent figure there. He held varying office positions. He was a clerk. He was a constable. So he was someone who was prominent. He was a freeman in the community of Marshfield. John Russell married Dorothy Howland. So the Howland and Russell families were merged together by that marriage, and a lot of the people who trace their descendancy through John Russell do so on the Howland side. So William Wing traces his ancestry through the Howland side, but that was another prominent Plymouth Colony family. So together they have a pretty long and varied line of descent. We don't know exactly when John Russell arrived in Dartmouth. He came sometime between 1662 and 1664, so perhaps before the colony was officially bounded, but it's more likely that it was closer to 1664 because he acquired his land from Miles Standish. So it would stand to reason that it was after the lands had been purchased by the Plymouth proprietors and that John Russell purchased his property from Miles Standish. So he was already in his 50s when he came to Dartmouth. Again, no good indication of why he decided to leave. Perhaps Marshfield at that time, being a community that was outside of Boston, perhaps was becoming too crowded. He had a family at that point. Maybe he was looking for lands to be able to pass down to his sons. So any one of those reasons, or all of them, or something different could have brought him to Dartmouth. But he didn't get here until he was in his 50s. His land holdings encompassed 400 acres that were known to be at Ponagansett, so Apponegansett. And his land stretched between Clark's Cove and the Apponegansett River. His homestead was built on what was referred to as the Old Fort Brook. So the brook that today is not very easy to see to the side of the Russell Garrison site, that was where his homestead was established. So we don't know what John Russell's house actually looked like. The indication and what the later reconstruction was based on were houses that were still standing at the time that dated back to the late 1600s. And one of the things that both William Wing discussed and then Oliver Ricketson used later in his reconstruction was the Thomas Tabor House. This is an illustration of the Thomas Tabor House that's at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. That house was built around 1678, so it was a little bit later than John Russell's house, but it's a pretty good indication of what a house looked like during that period, so that's what we go by. A couple of really important things here about John Russell that lead us into the period of King Philip's War. There were at least two situations that we know of where John Russell, as an official for the town of Dartmouth and a representative of the Plymouth court, was asked to intercede and to settle a dispute between native people in the community and colonial residents. So in both cases, there was a charge that damage had been done by native people to property that belonged to European settlers, to Euro-American colonists. And John Russell was appointed by the Plymouth Colony Court to be the intermediary and to settle the dispute. So what that suggests to me, as somebody who spends a lot of time looking at these records, is that John Russell had established some type of relationship with his native neighbors, with the people who lived in his community, that perhaps they had some type of working relationship. At this period in time, there were native people who were sometimes employed to help out with farm work. They were paid, ostensibly paid, but there were connections between colonists and native people at this time. So these two records that talk about John Russell's involvement with native people are really, I think, important, and they tell us a little bit more about what happened in years to come. Next slide, please. So King Philip's War is a complicated time in New England history. There wasn't any one sort of event that started the war per se, and it really was a series of escalating hostilities that began before 1675 and lasted after 1676. But for historians, we kind of bookmark these 2 years as being the prominent point in the history of King Philip's War. So Metacom, who was known as King Philip, was the son of the sachem Massasoit and the younger brother of Wamsutta. After Massasoit and Wamsutta died, Philip took over as the chief sachem of the Wampanoag people, whose homelands included all of Plymouth, the Plymouth colony as it existed, so almost all of southeastern Massachusetts, the Cape, and some other areas as well. The event, this image actually of King Philip is pretty famous. It was an engraving that Paul Revere did, actually, and it appeared in Benjamin Church's History of King Philip's War. Benjamin Church becomes a primary player in the events that happened at the Russell Garrison, and this was, whether or not it's an accurate likeness, I can't tell you, but this is a from the period, or from shortly after the period, likeness apparently of Philip. So the really precipitating events that kind of led to full-scale warfare, hostilities in southeastern Massachusetts were that Philip had engaged a native individual named John Sassaman, who had been educated at the Indian College at Harvard University, was fluent in English and served as an interpreter, oftentimes acting as an intermediary between Philip and the people of his village and colonists at the time. John Sassaman was termed, to use the kind of colloquialism, a praying Indian. So he had been part of the missionary movement of John Eliot and others, had ostensibly adopted Christianity, had agreed to be educated at Harvard, and was back in his community. John Sassaman was murdered in June of 1675, and 3 of Philip's closest confidants, native men who were close to him, were charged by Plymouth Colony of murdering John Sassaman and were hung. And that event really precipitated full-scale sort of violence among the Wampanoag people who were not allied with the colonists. So I'm not going to go into a real detailed description of King Philip's War. There are some excellent modern interpretations of King Philip's War that I would encourage you to look at that kind of take a different spin on it. One of them is a book that was just published this year by the historian Lisa Brooks, who is a native individual and has published a really good sort of reimagination or a retelling of the story of King Philip's War from an indigenous perspective that really gives you a different look at the whole incident. So after these 3 men, after John Sassaman was killed and these 3 men were hanged, there were a series of attacks that were reported on the colonial villages in Plymouth Colony by the men who were allied with Philip. And so probably most of you have seen the images that are throughout our New England history books of Indians who are dressed in war paint and with, tomahawks and hatchets, murdering colonists and burning their homes down. So there's probably truth in there, but that's not the whole truth. There definitely was destruction. There were definitely homes burned throughout the colonial settlements in Plymouth. And as a result, there were these garrison houses that were sort of established as safe places throughout the colony. So one of them was Cook's Garrison in Fairhaven. The other one that was in the area was John Russell's house. So looking back now at those 2 incidents that I talked to you about where John Russell was asked to adjudicate between some native individuals, I think it's more likely that the Russell Garrison was probably a known location. It was one of the few homes that was in Dartmouth at the time. It was on a main transportation route, both overland and on the water. John Russell was a prominent figure in the New England colony. And so I think this became actually just a known sort of safe spot for people to congregate and meet. We don't have any good evidence that the house itself was ever fortified in the sense that we would think about it. So in other words, there's no indication that the home that the Russell family lived in was altered as a defensive spot during King Philip's War. But it was during this period and in colonial records that Russell's home began to be referred to as the Garrison. And so that's where the name comes from that we go with today. Next slide. So there were a couple of events that were associated with the Garrison during King Philip's War that were recorded by people at the time as having happened at this location. The first one happened in July of 1675, so just a month after the murder of John Sassaman and then the execution of Philip's men. So a month later, there was a group of approximately 100 native people, likely from the Dartmouth area, who came to John Russell asking for protection. They did not want to be associated with the hostile activities of some of their Wampanoag kinsmen, and they wanted to be protected. So they came to John Russell and they said they would give up their weapons if he would ensure their safety. At least one person referred to Ralph Earl, who was also a Dartmouth resident at the time, and that individual had apparently been employed by Ralph Earl. So again, there's this connection, this prior relationship with Dartmouth's colonial residents and the native individuals. The native people were promised at the time that they would be safely treated, and according to the records we have, they were placed on a small island for their own protection. Some accounts refer to it as imprisoned or put onto a small island. Some later historians identified that as likely Little Island, and that makes sense. Here's Little Island, here's the Garrison site. And according to the records that are available, Little Island was actually part of John Russell's landholding, so that would make sense actually. So after being promised safe treatment, you can see that's the quote there. There was a letter that was written at the time. And down at the bottom here, this is just an image of Little Island taken from the shoreline there. Next slide, please. So after being promised this safe treatment, I'll let you go ahead and read through the quotes. I won't read them off. But these native people were taken to Plymouth, and they were considered by the Plymouth colony officials to be actual enemies, because probably they were native people. I don't think there was a distinction made between friendly and non-friendly native people by the head of the Plymouth colony there. And they were sold into servitude, which is actually something that happened fairly often during the end of King Philip's War. There were a lot of people in the Boston area who were interned, native people were interned on the Boston Harbor Islands, Deer Island in particular. Some of them, after the hostilities ended, were released and went back into their communities, but many, many, many people were actually exported to the Caribbean as slaves. So this event, we don't have any record of how John Russell responded to this, but presumably, you know, I can imagine that if he had promised these people, many of whom he probably knew pretty well, safe treatment, and then the colony completely rejected that, I would imagine there was probably some recriminations afterwards. So there was one more event that happened. So this is 1675. In 1676, as hostilities were winding down, Benjamin Church, he's pictured over there on the right, he was a primary actor leading the colonial regiments fighting against the Indians in New England. In July of 1676, Church records that a company of his men had been involved in a series of skirmishes in the Acushnet area, and they spent the night at, quote, Russell's Orchard. So again, referring back to the Garrison, there are a lot of descriptions that describe the Garrison as being in the area where Russell's Orchards were, so likely they were at the same site. They spent the night there. They arrived in darkness. They spent the night there. When they woke up the next morning, they found evidence that native people had also been camping there the night before, but had escaped or run away before the colonists woke up. So that was July of 1676. And then a month later in August, Benjamin Church's men caught up with Philip at Mount Hope, and he was executed, and that became essentially the sort of definitive end of King Philip's War. So those are the events that we know about that took place in the 1670s at the Russell Garrison. And I've given you a sample of the quotes, but there are a number of similar accounts by different people. So we not only have eyewitness accounts of these events, but they come from multiple people at the same time. So unlike local histories, which kind of get perpetuated and people repeat the same things over and over again, these are descriptions from people who were actually there when the events happened. So they're given a little bit more weight because they're not sort of written 100 years after the fact or even 50 years after the fact. They happened at the time. And they contribute to the significance of the site during the 1670s. Next slide, please. So there's really another big gap in the records after King Philip's War ended up until the beginning of the 1800s. There's one anecdotal story that we know. There was a will in 1773 for Abraham Sherman, who was a resident of Dartmouth, and in the inventory of his assets, there is a reference to a gun which killed an Indian across Pontiganset River from Ye Olde Castle on Russell's land to Heathen Neck. And the area that's referred to as Heathen Neck comes up a few times in other records. So this Star of the Sea area here, this is what was referred to as Heathen's Neck. Not sure how people feel about that name today, but supposedly the story is that this gun that was in the inventory, the reason it's mentioned is that supposedly there were people standing on the opposite shore of Pontiganset Bay, and a native person who was over on the Heathen's Neck side of the river they referred to it as a rude gesture at one of the colonists. And the colonist took aim with his rifle, which at that time, based on the little I know about firearms, were extremely inaccurate, and supposedly across the river shot and killed the offending Indian who had made this rude gesture. So the story itself, I can't vouch for the validity, but this becomes the beginning of a long series of references to the site of the Russell Garrison. So now we're talking about 100 years after the events of King Philip's War. It also indicates that this spot is being remembered as a place where Native people engaged with colonists. So shortly after King Philip's War ended, John Russell was actually noted in the records again as being one of 3 people in town to distribute some relief funds that had been offered to the town by a group of charitable Irish citizens who sent money over to help with reconstruction after King Philip's War. So he shows up in the records afterwards. And we know that sometime after 1676, he built a second home, John Russell did, on Rockland Street. And the original Garrison homestead passed down through his son and then some grandsons. And the Garrison home was apparently the birthplace of the Russell twins, as they're known, who became sort of the founding fathers of the modern-day city of New Bedford. So successive generations of Russells apparently lived in the Garrison house after John Russell left. John Russell died in 1695. His wife had died about 8 years earlier. And his second home, we know, was used as a school and then as a town meeting location. But we don't have any indication of when the original Garrison homestead either was taken apart and the materials reused elsewhere, whether it was abandoned. We don't really know. We don't have any good information about that, which is unusual given how important this location was to the town throughout history. But perhaps someday the missing information will appear. But as part of a lot of research done for the National Register nomination, that was not information that we were able to come up with. So the next reference that we have to the Russell Garrison site comes in 1925 when an edited version of Benjamin Church's account of King Philip's War was published. So it's an account of the war, but it's being edited, and in 1925, Samuel Drake, who did the editing, added a footnote where he talked about the cellars of the old Garrison. So that's in 1825. So at that point, the house was apparently gone, and what was still visible were the cellar holes. There's also a description in 1839 in a history of the town of Dartmouth, again referring to the cellars of Russell's Garrison that you can still see. And in 1892, Leonard Ellis, who wrote a history of New Bedford, he talks about the site, noting that at that point it was owned by Captain Charles Gifford. So These are just some of the remembrances, the written documentation of the site. It's still being remembered as the Russell Garrison, and it's still visible on the landscape. Next slide, please. So in January of 1889, there was quite a lengthy newspaper article written about the Garrison site, and I've extracted some of the information about it there for you to read. This was a tour that the reporter at the time made with Captain Jacob Howland, who walked around the site and described what was visible, what you could see, what the history was of the Garrison. And so you can see here that they're talking about not only what you're seeing in 1889, but 75 years earlier. Captain Howland is talking about what he remembers of the site from his boyhood. So some of the stones are there, the cellar hole depressions are still there, but there's not a lot of detail left to see sort of what went on with the site. And they do talk here about moving some of the stones around, which is another really interesting point that comes up later when the reconstruction happens. So the site's being maintained, but perhaps some of the stone that was visible on the surface was being moved around and reused for other purposes. Next slide, please. These images are from 1905, and they were made by Fred Palmer, who has a series of amazing photos of early homes and properties in the New Bedford area that's online at the New Bedford Whaling Museum's website. If you don't know about this, I definitely encourage you to check it out. The images are amazing. So he went around and photographed old houses in that period, at houses that were old in 1905. And it was accompanied, he published a book of his photographs, and it was accompanied by text from the historian Henry Worth, who talked about the history of a lot of the buildings. And it was kind of just by chance, actually, in doing the research at the New Bedford Whaling Museum, that these two images came out. So this is what the site looked like. You can see the river in the background to kind of give you some perspective. They're a little bit dark, so you can't see a lot of detail, but you can see here there's kind of, it looks like a mound of soil. To my eye, that looks like a mound of soil with some loose rocks in it. And then you've got mainly just this meadow grass, so no development whatsoever in kind of this mounded area, which again, the perspective is a little off. When you go to the site today, it's obviously pretty flat, so it's difficult to know exactly what perspective this came from. But you can see that the site, in 1905 is still completely undeveloped. Next slide, please. So most of the interpretive information that we have after those primary source records from the 1600s, what we know about John Russell, what we know about the site, much of it comes from William Wing, who delivered an address to the Old Dartmouth Historical Society, of which he was a member, in 1935, and it was a really detailed history of John Russell, of his family, of the events that happened at the Russell Garrison. And he had done a lot of research at that time with primary records, some of which are probably not available today. So these sort of intermediary histories from the early 1900s are really useful to a modern day researcher, because sometimes they're referencing or they're noting not only where original documents are that we can then go track down, but in some cases documents that have since gone missing. So in other words, William Wing referred to a couple of letters that he said were on file in various places, and when I tried to track them down, they're just not there anymore. So we're really relying on this as a great source of information. Wing is actually in this photo. He's got a number on his forehead right here. This is also at the Whaling Museum's, on the Whaling Museum's website, because of course the Old Dartmouth Historical Society in its modern day incarnation is the New Bedford Whaling Museum. And so Wing delivered this address in 1935, which was then published, and sort of brought about another wave of interest in the site of the Russell Garrison. He also, in his talk, focused a lot on what he believed to be the architecture of the original garrison, and that played really prominently into the reconstruction that happened about 20 years later. Next slide, please. So the next sort of really big informative news article about the Garrison site occurred in 1939. So again, you have a reporter who goes out and tours the property. This time he's with Mary Kirby, who owned the property at that time and had inherited it from her father, Charles Gifford. And one of the quotes that's in the article says, 250 years is a long time, and it is no wonder that there is nothing left of the original building built by John Russell. Yet for the curious, there is still something to be seen at the site of the old stockade. So 1939, remembering the Garrison, there's not a lot on the landscape, yet you can still see these depressions, and not only the property owners, but other members of the community still know where it is. Next slide, please. So in 1951, probably initiated by this talk that William Wing gave and sort of other information members of the Old Dartmouth Historical Society are talking about, the ODHS decided to act. So there was a development that was proposed by a local resident. He had actually drawn up plans for a subdivision. And you can see, I apologize, it's a little faint, but here are the lots that have been carved out. Here's the Garrison site. This was one of the probably primary lots that was going to be developed because it's a big lot and it's right there on the river. And Manchester had purchased what was referred to as the old Kirby property, so we know it was that site. And the Old Dartmouth Historical Society said that their initiative had been brought to a head by this residential expansion that was going on. And it's interesting because they say that the threat had not been imminent in the 275 years since the site had been occupied. So for the first time now in the 1950s, this spot that has been left alone is under threat. So prior to confirming that they wanted to purchase it, the ODHS brought one of their members to come and look at the site, and it was Oliver Garrison Ricketson, who at the time was retired from his professional career as an archaeologist, but was an archaeologist nonetheless. So they asked him to come in. He made an impression about what he thought was going on, offered to do some excavation, and the decision was made to purchase the site. Next slide, please. So, a little bit about Oliver Garrison Ricketson, because he's a really interesting person, unrelated to his connections with the Russell Garrison. He was born in 1864 in Pittsburgh. His father, Oliver Garrison Ricketson Sr., was a direct descendant of William Ricketson, who established his homestead on Ricketson's Point. And in fact, the family still had a compound on Ricketson's Point, and Oliver Jr. would go there from time to time. So that was how he was connected, even though he didn't live in Dartmouth. That's how he was connected to the ODHS and how he had knowledge about this area. Oliver's mother was Margaret Coleman Carnegie, who was the niece of the industrialist Andrew Carnegie. So he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, let's say. Lest you have any doubt, he spent most of his time on his family compound on Cumberland Island in Georgia. He was educated at the Middlesex School in Concord, and then he attended Harvard University. So he graduated, while he was at Harvard, he studied anthropology under some of the men at the time who were the prominent archaeologists of the day. So E.A. Houghton, Putnam, A.V. Kidder, these were people who were doing a lot of archaeology in the Southwest. Nobody cared about archaeology in New England during these days, but they were very interested in the archaeology of the Southwest. And so young Oliver was exposed to these men who at the time were really on the leading edge of archaeological research. So Oliver graduated from Harvard in 1916, and he actually entered the medical school and was planning to be a doctor. But he left to serve the Navy during World War I, and then he returned. He decided he did not want to be a doctor and decided instead to take up archaeology. So, as somebody who then was interested, he had already graduated, but he went out to Arizona for a period of time and did some excavations there with Samuel Guernsey, who was at Harvard University and also had become a prominent archaeologist. He also worked with the American Museum of Natural History, and then in the 1920s, Ricketson became involved through his association with the Carnegie Institute in excavations that were going on in Central America. And so he went to Mexico, and he worked on an expedition at Tulum, the Mayan city of Tulum. And so this image on the upper right is Oliver when he started his career. It's sort of your classic Indiana Jones type model here of an archaeologist back at the time. And he worked on some of the really prominent archaeological sites in that period in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. So he eventually ran his own excavations at sites in Belize and Guatemala and became a very well established and renowned archaeologist of the Central American indigenous periods. And he was apparently an excellent draftsman and mapper, and that was one of the skills that he brought to his work there. In 1941, Ricketson decided to retire from archaeology altogether, but he continued to stay in Central America. He lived with his wife in Guatemala for a time. He toured around, he gave lectures, he ran a lab, so he continued to be interested. Eventually, he came back to South Dartmouth to sort of spend his retirement years on the family compound. And it was just at that time that he became acquainted with the Russell Garrison and the purchase that was about to happen. So he decided that he would lend his expertise on a volunteer basis to conduct the excavations at the Garrison site for the Old Dartmouth Historical Society. Next slide, please. Oh, actually, yeah, that's fine. We're going to be here. So Ricketson's original handwritten field notes, which he kept for the duration of his excavations, are on file at the Whaling Museum. The Dartmouth Historical Commission has a copy of those records as well, so I was able to use both the original and the copies. And they include some really incredible detailed information. So there are plan and profile drawings, there are site maps, there are records of the weather, records of visitors. It also is how we know that Ricketson employed 3 local men who were laborers who did the bulk of the excavation under Ricketson's direction. And that's a direct reflection of what was going on in Mayan archaeology at the time, where you would hire local laborers who were not archaeologists or who were not trained to actually do the bulk of the excavation work under your direction. The excavations went on from June to September of 1951, the excavations and the reconstruction. In 1964, the Old Dartmouth Historical Society published a version of the notes which actually had been delivered as an address by Ricketson in 1951. So the notes themselves were never published, but the information and cleaned up versions of the drawings, which you're going to see in the next couple of slides, the sort of clean versions, come out of the published report in 1964, which actually was published after Ricketson died, because he died about a year after the excavations were completed. Next slide, please. So basically the work continued from June into probably the end of August on a more or less daily basis. These are some photographs. They're not great quality because they're reproductions of Ricketson out in the field, and you can see that really the site looks a lot like it did in 1905. So almost 50 years later, the site really looked pretty much the same. As I mentioned, he employed local laborers to help him, and at the time that Ricketson first went out to the site, he noted that there had been some preliminary grading that had been associated with bulldozing on some of the adjacent house lots, but that it hadn't really disturbed the site too much. And the thing that's important here is that he wrote in his notes that the bulldozer had uncovered a layer of oyster, clam, and quahog shell mixed with black ash, which he initially interpreted as a possible site where John Russell or whoever built his home had been making lime for the mortar. But actually he later went back in his notes and said he actually referred to it as an Indian clam bake site, which is what, based on that description, it probably was. So it seems likely that prior to the excavation and reconstruction, there was some vestige of an intact Native American, a more ancient Native American site on the property. Whether that's still there or not, we don't know. But Ricketson really limited his work to the area directly around the cellar holes. He didn't do much work beyond it. So when we prepared the National Register nomination, one of the things that we included was that the site itself, the property that's now owned by the town, has the potential in areas that weren't excavated by Ricketson to still have Native American materials there. Next slide, please. So Ricketson based his, both his excavation analysis and then the reconstruction that followed on William Wing's interpretations from the 1930s. So Ricketson was not a trained New England archaeologist. He wasn't that familiar with what to look for archaeologically at a 17th century Euro-American site. What he was used to in the Mayan area was much different. So he relied pretty heavily on a book that Wing had used as well, called the Early Domestic Architecture of Connecticut, and then also on the few examples that remained in the 1950s of homes from the late 17th century. So you can see there's Thomas Tabor's house. We saw a painting of it earlier. That was the chimney fall that was left. I'm not sure the date of that photo, but the house itself had been built in the 1670s. And then you can see top and bottom on the left there, those are images from this 1924 book about the architecture of Connecticut. And on the right are the two cellar holes that Ricketson excavated, and those are the same two that have been described over and over again in these 19th century accounts. So a larger, what he referred to as the north room on the right, and then a smaller south room on the left. Next slide, please. Next slide, thanks. So there's a close-up. This is, again, from that published report. And Ricketson talked about how he had excavated down through a lot of soil, but that there really weren't many artifacts that he found. He described in great detail both the north room and the south room, and he noted that he wasn't able to find any kind of a connection between those two. So how he interpreted this is that these were two parts of a house that had a ground level connection between them, and these were deeper cellars that were on the two halves of the house. The size and shape of these two rooms really do match up with more recent archaeological evidence from 17th century sites that have been excavated and documented. So even though Ricketson was flying in the dark a little bit, his interpretations were really were quite accurate. Next slide, please. So these are just some of his field notes that show that he was really paying attention to both the vertical excavations that he was doing and also to what he was seeing in plan view. So he initially cut a few trenches through these sloping walls that led up to the cellar holes, and then he excavated down into the cellar holes themselves. He didn't find any evidence of wood, either floor beams or ceiling beams. It was all stone. So he interpreted that as pretty good evidence that the house itself had been built of stone, even though he, again later, after reflection, decided that perhaps the above ground portion of the building had been wood and that those materials had been reused elsewhere, which was really common at that time because materials were in short supply, and if you had, hewn boards and timbers that were still in good shape when a house was abandoned, they were often salvaged, taken and used in another property. He interpreted the lack of artifacts that he found, Ricketson interpreted, as being a hastily built structure. So Ricketson interpreted this site as actually not Russell's home, but rather this temporary defensive fortification, which is not what William Wing said and not what every other sort of bit of information suggests. So whether Ricketson sort of thought that because there weren't a lot of materials there, we don't know. But looking at it with my modern day archaeologist eyes, I can tell you that typically things like a privy and a well and trash pits, they would have been away from the house and they would have been away from the water side of the house. So if you're thinking about the site today, where the road is today and where the modern day house is, which I'll talk about in a minute, those were probably the most likely areas for those parts of the homestead, and it's entirely possible that because Ricketson just focused on those two foundations that he just didn't identify those parts of the site. Okay, next slide, please. So after the excavations were finished, it took him about 6 weeks. So beginning in August, he started to reconstruct what he thought the building and the house would have looked like. We don't have any pictures of sort of the excavated cellar holes before the reconstruction started, unfortunately. They may exist, but I was not able to find them. So the images we have are the sketch drawings and Ricketson's notes, and then these photos, which were taken after the reconstruction was complete. Ricketson admitted, and we know this to be true, that he again relied really heavily on that 1924 book. So here you have an image from a site, an actual house site in Connecticut. Here's a sketch that Ricketson made in his notebook before the reconstruction happened, and here is the reconstructed Russell Garrison. So you can see they're almost identical. And he says right in his notes that he used that as a guide for reconstruction because he didn't have enough information about what the house looked like. He used primarily stone that had fallen in, that was in the excavated cellar holes, but he also talked about how he did have to bring some stone in to help reconstruct the walls. And the original walls were mortared with a shell lime that was really visible at the time. Ricketson did not use that. He used modern in 1950s terms, cement to put the site back together, but that's actually good for a modern day archaeologist because what that tells us is that we're able to know exactly what was reconstructed versus what was the original part of the foundation walls. I don't think that was Ricketson's intention at the time, but today when you do some type of historic reconstruction, you always use materials that are discernible from the original so that that's something that you're able to identify. So these are some photos of what the site looked like. The reconstruction was completed in September of 1951, and the photos at the bottom are actually from Ricketson's report. This nice clear photo that's above was probably taken later than 1951. I don't know the exact date, but you can see at this point the reconstruction is complete. There's a nice grass level floor. The granite posts with the iron chain that sort of identify the boundary of the reconstructed site are up, and we're looking back towards the spot where the modern house is today. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So here we have that beehive oven that we were just looking at. Here is the house that was constructed in 1963. It's only about 15 feet away from the north room. So if you remember, we had a north and a south room. This house was built where the south room was. Ricketson did not reconstruct the south room because he didn't have enough material or information about its function. He thought perhaps it had been maybe an earthen cellar with just some very minimal walls. So he did not include that as part of his reconstruction, which is why today you can see that the granite posts and the chain only go around the north room. But any evidence of the south room that was left and anything that was on that side of the site was unfortunately lost when that home was built. And then here again we have the published report in 1964. So as part of the celebration of Dartmouth's 300th anniversary, the site was really brought to attention again. There were a lot of publications. There was a lot of interest in what went on, and you can see there that's the boulder that sits in front of the site with the plaque, and it has the date of 1951 on it, but Judy and I were talking beforehand, and we're not exactly sure when that was put up, so maybe someone in the audience knows, but it may have been in 1951, close to 1951, when the Historical Society purchased the property, or it may have been put up as part of the 300th anniversary when the town was commemorating the site. In 1989, the Old Dartmouth Historical Society deeded the property to the town of Dartmouth. So at that point, the town assumed ownership and responsibility for the property. And by that time, if we can have our next slide, the site had fallen into disrepair. These photos, some of them are dated and some of them are not, but they're from the period of the 1970s. I got an extra 9 in there, 1970s and 1980s, but maintenance of the site was not regular. Vegetation had crept in. Some of the walls were starting to fall in, and it could have been partly based on the materials that Ricketson used. They might not have been sort of sustainable the way he put everything back together. So again, the site is still known. The site is still a landmark that people can come and visit, but it was not in the best state of affairs. So the Dartmouth Historical Commission recommended at that time in 1989 that the site be filled in, not only to protect these foundation walls that had been reconstructed because they were starting to cave or become unstable, but also for the safety of people who would come to visit the site. So the site was really pretty much unsafe. And according to a former Dartmouth Historical Commission chair who I spoke to when we were doing the townwide survey, the site was filled with clean sand, with the idea being that if anybody wanted to in the future go back and re-excavate and re-examine, it would be really obvious what had been filled in and what was original to the reconstruction. Next slide, please. So that brings us up to the present day and the process of getting the site listed in the National Register. Judy talked about how long the process is. We started this project in 2014. And 4 years later, the process is complete. It's very time consuming. PAL was contracted to complete the National Register nomination form, which included historical research, really in-depth historical research, collecting this information from all these sources. Site mapping, so you can see here we prepared a plan of the site and then took archival quality photos of the site from all different angles. We also documented the existing above ground remains that are visible today. So here you can see, here's that beehive oven. These are the stairs that originally led down into the cellar hole, and then here's a picture from kind of the same perspective after the reconstruction. So it's about 3 feet of fill. You know, the surface now is right about to here. This wooden lintel post that Ricketson added, that's long gone. But we documented the site conditions as they are now. And then next slide, please. So the really exciting thing about getting the site listed is that it was able to be listed in the National Register under all 4 of the criteria that are considered significant for listing. And that's really unusual. It's really, really unusual. So the site was, and it was all listed as significant at the local level. You can have a site nominated at the local, the regional, or the national level. So it met all of these conditions at the local level. So we have events or persons that are important to our history. John Russell is an early Dartmouth resident. The events of King Philip's War. And actually, even though typically a reconstructed building is not eligible for listing in the National Register, this site met an exception criterion because it was a reconstructed site, and it was reconstructed by an archaeologist who at the time was formative in the field of archaeology, so it kind of checked off the box there. And the site, as I mentioned, has the potential to have more that we don't know about it. So as an archaeologist, it's really important to keep sites preserved. When we dig sites up, we destroy the information. You can never put a site back in the ground. So even though I'm an archaeologist and that's what I do for a living, we always advocate for site preservation whenever possible. So it's entirely possible that there are more secrets to the Russell Garrison that are hidden in the ground, and my hope is that they will stay there. So the process went through. Not only did it have to go through the town first, Judy reviewed all of the draft information that we put together in the National Register. It was then reviewed by the Mass Historical Commission. Then there had to be a presentation made to the State National Register Review Board, at which point they voted to support the nomination. So it got checked off by the Massachusetts State Historic Preservation Officer. And then it went to Washington, D.C., where it sat, and they asked for some more information. We provided some more information. And that has led us to the formal and official listing of the site on the National Register. And with that, I thank you so much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer questions. I went a little over. I hope that's okay. I was trying to cut it down, but... Anyone have any questions or comments? Okay.